Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to take our first steps into the realm of animation by learning how to roll a ball in Maya. So to start, I'm just going to start throwing some objects into the scene. I'm going to start with a plane right here. So there's a floor for the ball to roll across. And then I'm going to click this button here to create a polygon sphere. I'll just bring that up. That's right about here. Now, before we can start animating, we need to talk about keyframes. In traditional hand-drawn animation, keyframes are drawings that define the starting and end points of a smooth transition. So take a pendulum, for example. The frames where the pendulum is changing directions are drawn as keyframes. Then an in-between is added at the exact middle position between the two keyframes. This in-between is often called a breakdown, and it helps define the arc of the transition. Once the arc is defined by the breakdown, more and more in-betweens are then added to create the illusion of motion between the two keyframes. The closer the in-betweens are, the slower the animation becomes, and with more in-betweens patched closer to the keyframes, it creates the effect of the animation speeding up and slowing down in and out of those keyframe positions. This is often referred to as ease in and ease out. This is a very time-consuming process when it comes to hand-drawn animation. However, one of the advantages of 3D computer animation is that it speeds up the in-betweening process greatly. So instead of drawing keyframes, we can instead pose our actor in 3D space in two different ways at two different points in the timeline, and then we can set those positions to be our keyframes. Then once we've set the keyframes, the software will be able to create all of the in-betweens automatically using a process called interpolation. So let's get to adding some keyframes to our ball here to animate it rolling from one point to another. Down below our viewport is the time slider, and this is where we can see what frame our animation is currently on and where all of our keyframes are placed. So to start, I'm going to select my ball here, and I'm going to just move it over here as my starting position. And then I want to set a keyframe for this movement on this axis. So to do that, I am going to go over here to the channel box. And I know it's moving on the Z axis, so I'm going to right-click Translate Z, and then select Key Selected. When I do that, a red bar appears next to the number, which means that there's a keyframe on this frame. And if we look down here in the time slider, there's now a red bar right here where I've keyed that frame. If I slide down the time slider, the keyframe for Translate Z will turn a pinkish color, which means that there is a keyframe on the channel, but it's not on the current frame. And I'm just going to go down a little bit further. And then I'm going to slide the ball over. I'm going to right-click Translate Z again and press Key Selected. And now, if I scrub on the time slider between the two keyframes, we can see that the ball moves between each keyframe smoothly. You can also set keys from the menu bar. Now, by default, the menu bar is set to the modeling set of menus. So if you want to access the animation menu bar, you have to go to this dropdown and select Animation. Once you have the animation toolbar active, you can go over to Key and then press Set Key, and that will set a key on every channel on your object. I don't necessarily want to do that most of the time. I want to be a little more specific about the channels I'm keying, but if I really did just want to key everything, that option is available to me. I could also press the S key by itself to do the same function. Now that I've set my keyframes, let's press play to see what it looks like in motion. And that doesn't look quite right. Why is it zooming through so fast? This is a problem with Maya settings. Sometimes the default for this is not necessarily to play this at 24 frames per second, but to play every frame as fast as possible. To fix this, we can go down here and press this button with the little running man with a gearbox. This opens the time slider preferences. From here, we could change the frame rate. We want to leave the frames at 24 FPS because that is the standard FPS for animation in the industry. But what we really want to change is the playback speed, which is currently set to play every frame. And we want to instead change that to 24 FPS times 1, and then hit save. So now when I press play again, it moves at a much more reasonable speed. Now, if I want to make my animation appear shorter or longer, I can do that by finding my keyframe in the time slider, holding Shift to click it, or holding Shift to drag over it, And then releasing shift, I can slide the keyframe around in the time slider. And then if we play it, the animation appears a lot faster because it takes less time to get from point A to point B. Interpolation is an incredible time saver when it comes to animation, but we still want to have control over how the software is interpolating between keyframes. To do this, we'll want to take a look at the graph editor. There are two ways to access the graph editor. We can go to Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor, and we'll make this pop up. Or I'm going to close this. I'm going to go to Windows, Workspaces, Animation, and that will change my whole workspace to be set up for an animation workflow. And the graph editor is automatically docked here just above my time slider and underneath my viewport. However, you could always just undock the graph editor as well, whatever works best for you. So with the graph editor open, I can select objects to see their keyframes plotted out on a graph. So if I select my sphere, I see the first and second keyframe here. The horizontal axis of the graph represents time progressing forward from left to right, while the vertical axis represents the values of each channel as they increase upwards or decrease downwards. And then each of these dots represents a keyframe at a particular frame in time with a particular value. Then between each keyframe, we have a curve which represents the interpolation between the two keyframes. Navigating in the graph editor is similar to navigating in the viewport. Simply hold Alt and then use the middle mouse button to pan around the graph. And if you want to zoom in and out, you can use the scroll wheel. Then if you select a keyframe, you can press F to focus on it. So if I get really zoomed out, I can just press F again to find it. And the same works if I select multiple keyframes. So just like with the time slider, I can move these keyframes around as well. So if I just select this, I can then grab it, slide it around. If I move it all the way over here, the animation will be slower and it'll start earlier in the shot. And because I adjusted the height, the ball is actually moving backwards. So now it's a much longer animation that goes much further. If I want to move a keyframe on a single axis, I can select it. And then with shift held, I can move it in one direction and it'll stay locked to that direction. So I can just move it along the frames, or I could keep it on the same frame and move the position. So by default, these keyframes are set to have a Bezier curve interpolation. That means instead of creating a straight line between the 2 points, Maya creates this curve between them that, when in motion, appears to gradually pick up speed and slow down in a way that feels smooth and natural. So we can see when it moves, starts slow, picks up speed, and then slows back down. We can change the trajectory of this curve by selecting one of these points and then rotating the handles or tangents that appear. By adjusting the curves, we can alter how Maya interpolates between the 2 points. So I'm just adjusting these curves to overshoot going in and out of the animation. So then when I press play, now there's a little bit of anticipation and an overshoot. That was a bit extreme, so I'm going to adjust that a little bit. Play it again. There we go. Now let's say I didn't want Maya to smooth this out and I wanted it to draw a straight line between the 2 points instead. To do that, I'm going to select one keyframe and I'm going to press this button to activate linear tangents. And what that does is it points the tangents directly at the next keyframe. So it's drawing a straight line to that next point. So what that means is when this animation starts, the ball will already be going at maximum speed and then will slow down. Then if I make both of these keyframes tangents linear, then the entire animation will become linear, with the ball moving at the exact same speed from point to point before stopping immediately. If you want to cut out the interpolation entirely, and we just want to have the ball snap from point to point, we can do this too by selecting our keyframes, and then pressing this button right here to activate stepped tangents. This will cause the animation to snap from pose to pose instantly. So this is really good if you're doing character animation and you want to make sure that all your poses look good on their own. While we certainly could keep animating with this primitive sphere for our animation, if what we're animating requires more precise control over the object we're animating, then we want to be using a rig rather than simple geometry like this sphere. Put simply, a rig is an object which has an underlying skeleton, which can be posed for animation, as well as a set of controls for posing said skeleton. To use a rig in Maya, typically we want to be referencing an external file to bring the rig into our scene. So to do that, I will first need a rig to reference. For this, I'll be using the Basics Ball Rig by Carlos Contreras, which I will leave a link to in the description. So I already have this rig on my desktop and it's already unzipped. So all I need to do is open up my project, which is right here, open up my scenes folder, and then drop the basics rig folder into the scenes folder. Once I've done that, I can close out the Explorer, go back to Maya, and then to actually reference that rig, I'm going to go to File, Create Reference, and it should open to your scenes folder. From there, I'm going to open up the basics rig folder, and there are a couple rigs in here, but I'm going to go ahead and use the basics ball rig. Hit reference, and there it is. With that in the scene, I'm going to go ahead and delete my old sphere so we can just focus on the rig. So currently this object is referenced, which means that it's not natively built into the scene. Instead, it is being extracted from an external file, which was the rig file that I just opened, and then being sort of echoed into this scene. So I can't make heavy changes to this file because it's not native to the scene. But if I were to make changes in that external file, they would then persist to this scene. So why would I be so particular about referencing when I could import the rig instead so that it's native to my scene file? The reason why we want to get used to referencing rigs is that a lot of times, especially on professional productions, the rig file might get updated. In that case, if you're referencing the rig as an external file, it's easier to get that updated rig in your scene without having to redo everything. Whereas if the rig is imported, there's no way to swap it out for the updated version of the rig. It'll be forced to redo the entire animation with the updated rig. Now, it might not look like it, but even this ball has a skeleton in it. And that skeleton is animated by keyframing the controls which surround it, which are these yellow, blue, and red lines we can see here. To see these curves a little bit better, I'm going to go over up here in the viewport and select this button to turn on multi-sample anti-aliasing. And that just makes these curves look a little bit thicker. While I'm up here, I'm also going to turn on screen space ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is just the effect of light being trapped and being lost when two surfaces are close together. So it helps us see that the object is on the ground by just creating a nice little shadow there without having to actually have lighting in the scene. So for an example of posing this ball with the controls, I'm going to select this curve here, this ring, and I can move the ball this way using that control. And then using this control on top, I can move it down to add a squish effect to the ball. And then if I select this sort of dark red cage going around the ball, I can then rotate it around. And the squish effect applies the same no matter how the ball is rotated. So this is just a very small example of how rigs are really useful in giving us more control over our animated objects than geometry alone. So I'm just going to undo that real quick, get back to our default position. And the next thing I want to do before animating properly is create a camera. And I want to set up the shot how I want it. You'll notice in the outliner, we already have several cameras in our scene, but these are our working cameras. Instead, we want to create another camera to act as the camera that we will film our animation from. There are two ways to create a camera. One, I could go up to Create, Cameras, Camera, and it puts a camera in the scene right here. But one of the ways that I really like to create cameras is to position my perspective camera where I want it to be. Let's say right here as a starting place. And then in the viewport menu bar, I'm going to go to View, Create Camera from View. And when I did that, it created this Persp 1 camera. We can see it there in the outliner. And we can see that the name of the camera is displayed here at the bottom of the viewport. Once I have that camera, I want to double click it to rename it. I like to call my cameras Render Cam. And then to really figure out how this camera will look when filming, I'm going to turn on my resolution gate by going up here in my viewport. I'm going to click this button right here. It looks like a square with a blue circle in the middle. That turns on the resolution gate, which puts a frame around my viewport, which shows me exactly what resolution this will film at. I can see up here at the top that it's set to record at 960 by 540 resolution. And that's a little bit small, but we'll change that later. Next, I want to switch to a dual viewport mode so that I can still navigate around the scene freely, but also see what my render cam is showing. So to do that, I'm going to press this button here on the very left to switch to a dual panel layout. And then the right camera is automatically set to my free roaming perspective camera. Whereas the panel on the left got set to a front orthographic view. So to change this to my render cam, I'm going to go to Panels, Perspective, Render Cam. And then finally, I am just going to go up here to this button that shows a camera with a lock next to it to lock my camera, which means now I can't accidentally rotate around the scene or navigate around, because that's really easy to do if you don't have your camera locked. So this way I'll make sure that I have a very consistent frame here as I'm working. So now I'm just going to repeat that process of setting up my animation. Quick tip though, if you are struggling to select the rig because you keep selecting this plane underneath it, you can always add this plane or any other object to a separate layer, which you can then lock so you can't select it again. So I've got this plane selected, and then I'm gonna go over here in my channel box / layer editor. And at the bottom, there are these 4 icons. I'm gonna click the last one to create a new layer and assign selected objects. Then once I've created that layer, I'm gonna rename it. By double clicking it, it'll pop up this window. I'm just gonna call this plane layer. Hit enter and save. And with a layer, I can toggle the visibility by pressing the box on the left. And if I press the box on the right, I can set this to a template, which means it turns into a wireframe that I can't select. Or if I select it again, it changes to R for reference, where I can still see the object, but I can't select it anymore from the viewport. I can still select it from the outliner, but just not the viewport, where it's a lot easier to select it by mistake. Now that I'm sure I'm not going to select the plane by accident, I'm going to go back to my rig, and I want to move this to the starting position. But the problem is, which of these controls do I actually move to the starting position? Well, each of these controls exists in a hierarchy. So if I were to select one of these controls, let's say this one, and then go over to my outliner and press F, that group will expand to show me the entire hierarchy down to that point. And so anytime something higher in the hierarchy is moved, that change will persist to all of the objects beneath it. So I can move this ring around and it moves all the other controls underneath it with it. But then if I select this ring and move that around, it'll move everything beneath that in the hierarchy, but not this outer ring. So for finding a starting position, I want to move the highest object in the hierarchy to that point. So I'm going to select this ring right here with the arrow, because I can see that this is the controller that's at the top of the hierarchy. Anytime that an object is at the top of the hierarchy, anything that's below it will be highlighted in green, as well as the object you selected. And then I'm just going to move this down here. Once I've moved the base controller to its starting position, I don't want to move it anymore or set any keyframes on it, because in most instances, you want the top controller in the hierarchy to be stationary, and for the rest of the rig to move in relation to that base controller. So instead, I'm going to select the next controller in the hierarchy and use that for my animation. And then from there, I'm going to select Translate Z, right click it, and key selected. And I put that keyframe pretty far towards the end of the shot. So instead, I'm going to shift left click it and move that frame all the way to the beginning. Now, it's a bit of a long process to right click a channel and then go key selected every single time you want to add a new keyframe. It's only 2 clicks, but that adds up a lot over time. So there is a way to speed up the process of keyframing, and that is to go down here to this little icon of a keyframe surrounded by 2 arrows to turn on auto keyframe. And while this is red, anytime that you move an object on a specific channel, it will set a keyframe for that change you just made. So if I start at 1 and then go down to 70, and I move this ball into frame over here, to right about there, it automatically sets a keyframe for that frame. And I don't have to go right click, key select it every time. This only works on channels that I've keyed once, so it won't work on, say, the X-axis, so long as I haven't keyed it. Now you notice when I hit play, my animation doesn't play in the render cam view. This is because I have another default setting in mind, which I'll show you how to fix right now. So I'm going to go down to the little running man again to open the time slider preferences. And then from here, I want to change update view from active to all and hit save again. And now we can see it playing in both windows. The reason for this is because at any given time, there's always one active viewport, and that is indicated by whichever viewport has this white box around it. So if I were to click the render cam, that viewport becomes the active viewport. This will come up again later, so remember that. But for now, the easy fix for seeing the animation play in all viewports is in the time slider settings. And I think I'll just adjust this animation to speed it up. So now it'll only take 2 seconds or 48 frames for the ball to reach the end point. And I'm pretty happy with that motion. So now I'm going to go ahead and add some rotation to that. So to do that, I'm going to select this controller here. And I'm just going to figure out which axis I want to rotate it in. Looks like it's the X-axis. And then I'm just going to set a keyframe on that first frame. And then I'm going to find the last frame that this animation ends on, which is 48. Press F to zoom to focus back in on it. It's new position. And then I'm going to select the rotation controller again. I'm just going to start by rotating it around. Or I could just set this to negative 360 just to see what that looks like to start. And it looks okay. I don't think it's moving quite realistically enough against the ground. If I scrub through this point from 12 to 24, I can see how the band here connects with the ground, and it looks like it's sliding when it makes that connection. So to fix this, I actually want to adjust how much it rotates by the time it gets to the end. So to do that, I'm going to select this controller, and I'm going to grab this last keyframe. While holding shift and middle click, I'm going to adjust it downwards so the ending rotation is a greater value, which means throughout the animation, it will rotate faster. So it looks like it's sliding a little bit, so I'm going to rotate it more. Maybe just a smidge more. I'm just eyeballing it now. There are certainly calculations you could do to get this to be exact, but that's not worth it for this exercise. All right, and then I'm going to give it a play. Much better. That feels about right to me. If these controls are getting in the way, especially in your render cam, we can always turn them off by going to Show, up in the viewport menus, and then going down to viewport. And here we see a list of all of the objects that will show up in this viewport. And the one we want to turn off is called NURBS Curves. Back when Maya was first created, every object was made out of something called NURBS surfaces rather than polygons. Polygons emerged and they were a lot easier to work with, so NURBS are not nearly as used anymore. But they are used for controllers because they won't render in a final image, and they're easy to see because they keep the same thickness no matter what distance you view them at. But we want to turn them off, so I'm going to uncheck NURBS curves, and then we no longer see it in the render cam. And now it's a lot easier to see that animation play. Finally, once I'm happy with my rotation, I want to make the beginning of this animation linear so it looks like a force had hit it and it starts at the top speed and then slows down. So the best way to do that is to make all of my keyframes linear at once. So I'm going to select my rotation controller, and then holding shift, I'm going to select the controller I use to translate it. And I can see that all of those keyframes appear in my graph editor at once, and I can see both objects listed here with the channels which are keyed. And then I'm just going to click and drag over these keyframes here. It's hard to tell, but this is actually two keyframes overlapping each other. They're just on the same point. And then I'm just going to make them linear. And now when this animation plays, we see it at its top speed, and then it slows down. Now let's say I wanted to make it look like the ball rolls back a little bit after it reaches the furthest point. So what I can do for that is find the point that I want it to roll back to, let's say right here on frame 39. And then I'm going to select both of these curves, hold right click, and select Insert Key. And that's another way to add keyframes for the graph editor instead. And this time it added keys right where the curve is at this point in time. However, that didn't really change my animation. The animation is still playing just the same, but now Maya has noted this frame as a keyframe. But what that means is I can select these keyframes, hold shift, and then drag them to the end. And now these tangents look a little bit weird, so I'm just going to press this button here to turn on auto tangents to make the Bezier curves straighten out again. And now when I hit play, the ball rolls back. Now that I see it in motion, I'm not really happy with how far it rolls back. I want it to go back a lot further. So I can just delete these keys and repeat the process. Let's say it goes back pretty far, like right here. Right click, insert key, and I'll drag these back. And I'll maybe make the beginning of the animation play a little bit faster. There we go. Now the rolling backwards looks a little bit unmotivated at the moment. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a wall for it to rebound off of. So going to frame 38, this is the furthest point. I can then just go to my poly modeling shelf, make a cube, scale it up. I'm gonna bring it up right to the point where it turns around. And I'll press play. And it's almost there. All I have to do now is select my controllers, select these keyframes, and make these linear as well. And once I hit play, the ball now approaches the wall without slowing down, turns around abruptly after bouncing off of it, and then slows to a stop. I think I can make this work a little bit better if I make it roll in even faster. Move these keyframes down further to slow down the movement after the bounce. There, that feels pretty natural. Now I think this shot is actually a little bit long because it plays, we see the ball roll in, and it stops, and we just kind of sit with a whole bunch of extra time. So we want to cut this down. Now we can change the playback range of this shot by just grabbing here and sliding this in. So now it'll end and loop around sooner. But this isn't actually shortening the shot. So if we look down below the time slider, we'll find the range slider. And we can see this bar here, which shows 1 to 80. And these are the frames that we can see currently. But the actual length of the shot is determined here, where it says it is 200 frames. So this is useful if you want to loop over a quick part of the animation frequently. So if I brought it down to, say, just want to watch that last bit of the animation and press play, I can see that looping over and over. But it's not the length of the actual shot. The length of the shot is 1 to 200. So to make that shorter, I can just set the length of the shot itself down to something smaller like 100. Make it a little bit shorter to 90. And that seems appropriate. Once I've got my animation in a pretty good place, I want to make a movie of it so that I can view it outside of Maya. This is going to be what's called a play blast. A play blast is a recording of your animation that Maya can make straight out of the viewport. rather than rendering out the entire scene with detailed lighting and everything. It's going to be exactly as it appears here in the viewport. This is helpful for one, because you can share your animation easily with others without them having to open up Maya and without having to require you to make a fully rendered version of it, which takes much longer. And also because when I press play in Maya, there's no guarantee that this is exactly 24 frames per second, especially as my scenes get larger with more characters, more complicated characters. And if my machine is not up to the task of moving all those things smoothly, I might see it at a lower frame rate than 24 frames per second. So we want to be making play blasts so we can ensure that our animation is timed correctly. So to make a play blast, I'm going to go up here to playback and select the first option here, play blast. It's just sort of run it through my animation, and it gives me this. Now, there's a few things wrong with this. For one, it recorded from the wrong viewport. I wanted it from the render cam, but it rendered from the perspective camera. This is because my perspective cam viewport was the active viewport at the time, whereas I want the render cam viewport to be the active viewport when I press play blast. Second of all, this resolution does not match my resolution gate here. And third of all, the quality is just very low. So let's tweak some settings to get a better play blast. I'm going to close this. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the render settings, which is accessed here with the clipboard with the little gearbox icon. That's going to open up this menu. There's a lot of different things we could mess with right now, but we're not going to be rendering a full scene, so we don't want to mess with all of this. Instead, I'm just going to go down here to the image size category. I'm going to go to presets. I'm going to change this to HD 1080. So now the resolution will be 1920 by 1080p. And then I'm just going to go ahead and delete the perspective camera from the renderable cameras list. So it's just render cam. Then go ahead and close that. Next up, I'm going to go back up to playback. And instead of pressing play blast, I'm going to select the square next to it to open the play blast settings. So from here, there's a couple things I want to do. First of all, I'm going to change the display size to from window to from render settings. That will ensure that it actually renders at 1920 by 1080. Then I'm going to change the scale from 0.5 to 1. And I'm going to leave quality alone. You could turn this up, but play blasts don't necessarily need to be the highest quality possible. Then down here, I'm going to select save to file and just check that on to make sure that it's actually saving that movie. And we can give that file a name. So I'm just going to call this ball rebound. And if I press browse, I can see where it's going to go to, and I can see that it goes straight to my animation project movies folder. I'm going to close that. And before I hit play blast, I'm just going to make sure that this is the active viewport. And then I'm going to hit play blast. Now we're almost there. There's one thing I forgot to do, and it's turn off my resolution gate. The resolution gate is really nice for figuring out the size of the frame, but we don't really want it on the whole time. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to turn off my resolution gate. And then one more thing, I'm going to turn off my grid using this button here, just because it's also kind of getting in the way visually. And then once all that's off, I'm going to go up to playback, press play blast. And because we already saved a play blast under this file name, it's asking me if I want to overwrite it, which I will hit OK. And there we go. Now we have a very nice, clean recording of that animation that didn't take any time at all to actually create. And I can pass this along for critique. So with that, you should have everything you need to start animating in Maya. And so I wish you luck, and I hope you have a good day.